The galaxy, for all its glittering spires and star-forged treaties, was still a place where people killed each other over the same things they always had: territory, resources, and the occasional insult delivered in the wrong dialect. The enlightened Concord liked to pretend otherwise. They called themselves the pinnacle of civilization, a coalition of 37 species who had, through centuries of negotiation, established rules for how to wage war without making it awkward to sit across from each other at peace conferences. Their rules were elaborate. Fleets could only engage after formal declarations, prisoners had to be treated with meticulous care, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure was strictly forbidden, unless, of course, it was deemed strategically unavoidable, which was a phrase broad enough to drive a dreadnought through. The Concord even had a definition for mercy: sparing an enemy's life so they could be ransomed, traded, or paraded as proof of one's moral superiority. It was never about kindness. It was about optics. Then came the humans. A relatively new addition to the Concord, they were still regarded as a curious experiment. Primitive bipeds with a baffling tolerance for chaos and a tendency to improvise in situations where every other species would prefer a committee meeting. The official diplomatic assessment was that humans were spirited. The unofficial one was that they were a disaster waiting to happen. The disaster in question arrived during the War of the Karth Dominion. The Karth were a reptilian empire with a fondness for conquest and a deep disdain for the Concord's etiquette. They had launched a swift invasion of Dara, a Concord border world rich in mineral deposits and inconveniently close to human space. The Concord responded with a full fleet under Commander Vril of the Sithari, renowned for his precision, his discipline, and his ability to win battles without raising his voice. Humans were present only as auxiliary forces, a token gesture to integrate them into Concord operations without giving them any real opportunity to cause trouble. Among them was Captain Elias Rourke, commander of the Halcyon Blade, a corvette so small it was practically an afterthought in the fleet's formation. Vril had assigned Rourke to the outer perimeter, where he could do the least damage to the battle plan. The engagement unfolded with mathematical perfection. Vril's fleet executed a flawless encirclement of the Karth flagship, cutting off its escape vectors and crippling its escort ships with precision strikes. The Karth commander, faced with inevitable defeat, initiated the formal surrender protocol, an elegant process involving encrypted transmissions, ceremonial phrasing, and the mutual understanding that no one would do anything rash before the paperwork was complete. Unfortunately, Rourke had not read the paperwork, or more likely, he had read it and decided it was optional. Without waiting for orders, the Halcyon Blade broke formation and accelerated toward the Karth flagship. Concord tactical channels erupted in confusion, and Vril's voice, normally as calm as a glacier, rose by a fraction of a decibel, which for a scythery was the equivalent of screaming. The human corvette latched onto the Karth flagship's hull, breached its airlocks, and deployed a boarding party. The Concord fleet watched in stunned silence as Rourke's crew fought their way to the Karth command deck, bypassing every carefully negotiated ritual of surrender. Minutes later, the human captain emerged on the comms, helmet under his arm, dragging the Karth commander by the collar. Every species in the fleet expected the next step to be a public execution or some crude display of dominance. Instead, Rourke stunned them all by releasing the Karth commander, alive, uninjured, and very much aware of what had just happened. The human simply shoved him back toward his own crew and returned to the Halcyon Blade without explanation. Commander Vril was incandescent in the way only a being with no visible facial expressions could be. To him, this was not just a breach of protocol, it was an act of barbarism wrapped in a gesture of civility. The Concord had rules for mercy, and whatever Rourke had just done did not qualify. The real shock, however, was still to come. Because when Vril demanded to know why the human had spared the enemy commander, Rourke's answer would change the Concord's understanding of mercy forever, and not in a way that made anyone sleep better at night. The Concord Council Chamber was designed to intimidate. It was a cathedral of polished alloy and suspended light, with acoustics engineered so that every word carried the weight of a verdict. Commander Vril stood before the assembly, his posture a perfect diagram of restrained fury. Beside him, Captain Elias Rourke looked as though he'd wandered in from a bar fight and was wondering when someone would bring him a drink. The council demanded an explanation. They expected the usual human theatrics. Some nonsense about honor, a half-baked appeal to ancient Earth warrior codes, perhaps even a sentimental speech about peace. Instead, Rourke leaned forward, resting his hands on the table as though about to tell a joke. "I let him go," he said, "because killing him would have been too quick." The chamber shifted, a ripple of discomfort passing through the delegates. Rourke continued, his voice steady, almost conversational. He described how the Karth commander would now have to return to his homeworld and face the wreckage of his fleet, the loss of his soldiers, the collapse of his supply lines. He would have to answer to his superiors, to his people, to the history books. He would live long enough to watch the empire he fought for shrink in on itself, knowing he had been the one to lead it into ruin. That, Rourke concluded, is mercy. Letting someone live long enough to understand exactly how badly they lost. Silence settled over the chamber. For the Concord, mercy was a transaction, a calculated move in the great game of interstellar politics. The human version was something else entirely, a weapon that struck not at the body but at the mind. It was, the council realized with a faint sense of unease, far more efficient than any orbital bombardment. Vril, who had spent his career perfecting the art of clean, bloodless victories, found himself unsettled. The humans' approach was not about leverage or negotiation. It was about ensuring the enemy carried their defeat like a parasite, feeding on their pride until there was nothing left. It was, in its own way, crueler than annihilation. Word of the incident spread faster than any official communique. Within weeks, military strategists across the galaxy were debating the implications of human mercy. The Karth commander, once a figure of fear, became a cautionary tale whispered in officer academies. His every public appearance was dissected for signs of the humiliation that clung to him like a shadow. He resigned within a year, though some said he had resigned the moment Rourke let him walk away. Other powers took note. Some began surrendering earlier in battles against human forces, hoping to avoid whatever psychological gauntlet this peculiar species might devise. Others tried to imitate the tactic, though without the same unnerving sincerity. The difference, it seemed, was that humans didn't see this as a strategy at all. To them, it was simply obvious. The Concord eventually stopped questioning it. They placed human units in more prominent positions, not because they were the most destructive fighters, though they were certainly capable of that, but because their victories lingered. A battle won by humans was never truly over. It echoed in the minds of the defeated, reshaping them long after the shooting stopped. And so the definition of mercy changed. No longer was it a polite gesture extended to an enemy for the sake of diplomacy. Now, in the official Concord lexicon, mercy was a deliberate act of sparing an opponent in order to ensure the enduring comprehension of their failure. The humans didn't write that definition, of course. They didn't need to. They already knew. As for Rourke, he returned to his ship and his crew, unbothered by the political ripples he'd caused. When asked later if he thought the Karth commander would ever recover, he'd shrugged and said, "I hope so. Otherwise, what's the point?" And that, dear listener, is how the most civilized coalition in the galaxy learned that humans don't just win wars, they let you live through them, which, as it turns out, is much worse.